A routine roadside check turned into a humiliation for a black woman. The cops had no idea who her husband was, and when the truth came out, the aftermath shocked everyone. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The city lay under a blanket of quiet, the streets nearly empty as late-night hours slipped past. It was nearly midnight as Lauren Harris drove down the deserted highway, her thoughts a blend of exhaustion and satisfaction. She had just finished a full day filled with meetings and public appearances. Every hour had been spent speaking, listening, nodding. She felt fulfilled, as though her hard work was paying off, but the toll of the day was heavy. As she drove, the faint notes of classical music hummed softly through the car speakers, a welcome comfort against the silence of the empty road. Lauren gazed at the open road ahead, the street lights flickering past as though they were the only signs of life in the sleeping city. Her mind drifted, weaving through fragments of the day, handshakes, smiling faces, endless questions. But tonight, in her private world of quiet and music, she felt removed from that public life. She enjoyed this rare moment of solitude. Out of nowhere, she noticed flashing lights in her rearview mirror. A police car was tailing her, the blue and red lights glaring against the dark. At first, she didn't process what was happening. It felt so out of place, almost surreal. But the lights grew brighter. The car edged closer, and then the loud command over the speaker brought her back to reality. They wanted her to pull over. The request made her pulse quicken, but she tried to calm herself. She knew that she hadn't broken any laws, hadn't done anything to warrant attention. This had to be a routine stop, maybe a standard check. Still, the situation seemed strange. Her mind raced with a mix of unease and curiosity, and as she slowed her car to the side of the road, a sense of foreboding washed over her. When she finally came to a stop, she took a deep breath. She glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was just a few minutes shy of midnight. She looked around, but there wasn't a single other car in sight. The stillness and isolation of the empty highway added to her discomfort. As the flashing lights bathed her car in an eerie glow, Lauren waited, her hands resting tensely on the steering wheel. 2 officers approached her car. She noticed them in the side mirror, observing their deliberate, almost leisurely gait. The taller one, Officer Jackson, walked with a swagger, his figure looming as he approached the driver's side. His partner, Officer Rivera, trailed slightly behind, his hands in his pockets, his stance casual yet calculating. As they came closer, the uneasy feeling in Lauren's stomach deepened. She took another breath, steeling herself. The officer rapped on her window, and Lauren lowered it slowly, forcing herself to remain composed. "Evening, ma'am," Officer Jackson greeted her. His voice was curt, lacking warmth. He scanned her with a piercing, appraising look that made her feel exposed, even vulnerable. "License and registration," he said, his tone carrying an edge she couldn't ignore. Lauren complied, reaching into her bag. As she handed over her documents, she noticed the way Jackson's gaze lingered on her attire and her car, his expression shifting to something she couldn't quite place. There was a glint of something resentful in his eyes, a sneer hidden beneath the surface. "Nice car," he commented, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Fancy for a late-night drive, don't you think?" Lauren felt a chill creep down her spine. She knew she shouldn't respond, knew she should stay polite and reserved, but the hostility in his voice unsettled her. "I'm just on my way home," she replied carefully, maintaining her composure. Jackson exchanged a look with Rivera, who smirked. There was an air of familiarity between them, as if they shared an unspoken understanding. "Yeah, I bet you are," Jackson said, his voice low and dismissive. He looked her up and down, his eyes scanning her with a judgmental gaze that made her skin prickle. The two officers continued their silent assessment of her, exchanging glances and muttered words she couldn't quite make out. Lauren felt her discomfort mounting. She realized with growing dread that this was not an ordinary stop. The way they looked at her, resentment mingling with a hint of amusement, made it clear that there was more to this encounter than she had anticipated. Lauren tried to keep calm, but the tension in the air was palpable. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, feel the judgment in their sneering expressions. It wasn't just a routine stop. These officers were looking at her not just as a driver on the road, but as something else, a target, an object of disdain. "You got somewhere important to be, ma'am?" Rivera asked, his voice mocking, as if he knew the answer already. "I'm just trying to get home," she replied, her voice steady but tinged with unease. Jackson laughed, a hollow sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "Well, it's a good night for a little checkup, wouldn't you say?" He looked back at Rivera, who nodded in agreement, his smirk widening. Lauren felt a surge of defensiveness, but she knew better than to challenge them. She reminded herself that she was a public figure, a known name in the city, but tonight, in the darkness of this lonely road, it felt as though her identity, her status, meant nothing to these men. It was as if they saw her as a mere intruder in their domain. She watched as Jackson continued to scrutinize her, his gaze cold and dismissive. He seemed to relish the power he held in this moment, the authority to keep her here as long as he wanted. "Let's see what we have here," Jackson muttered, flipping through her documents with a barely hidden disdain. He looked at her license, his lips curling into a smirk. "Mrs. Harris, huh? Sounds important." Lauren stayed silent, sensing the danger in any reply. "Must be nice, huh, driving a car like this?" Rivera chimed in, leaning in closer. "Must be real nice having that kind of privilege." Lauren's heart pounded. She realized that their resentment wasn't just directed at her as an individual, but at what she represented in their eyes. They saw her as part of a world they despised, a world of privilege, wealth, and power. And they were intent on making sure she knew it. Jackson leaned in, his face close to hers. "We're gonna need you to step out of the car, ma'am." The words hit her like a blow. She hesitated, her mind racing. Every instinct told her to refuse, but she knew that defiance would only escalate the situation. Reluctantly, she unbuckled her seatbelt, her hands trembling slightly, and opened the door. She stepped out onto the cold pavement, the night air biting against her skin. The officers surrounded her, standing too close, their presence oppressive and menacing. Jackson moved in, his hand brushing against her arm in a way that felt invasive. Rivera stood back, watching with a detached smirk, as if savoring the moment. Lauren's heart pounded in her chest as she forced herself to remain still, her mind screaming with alarm. She felt trapped, surrounded, and completely at their mercy. The officers exchanged a brief glance, a silent communication that made her stomach churn. She realized in that terrible moment that this was not about law enforcement. This was about power, about control, about their desire to assert dominance over someone they viewed as entitled and out of place. As she stood there, vulnerable and isolated on that dark road, she knew that she was caught in a situation that went far beyond a simple traffic stop. And the night was just beginning. The chill of the night air seeped into Lauren's skin as she stood outside her car, feeling the suffocating presence of Officers Jackson and Rivera looming over her. She fought to keep her composure, to quiet the rising sense of dread clawing at her insides. Her heart thudded loudly in her chest, each beat a reminder that she was alone with these men, and that there was no one around to help. Jackson looked her up and down, his gaze lingering, assessing her in a way that felt far too personal. "Spread your arms, ma'am. Routine check," he drawled, his tone dripping with mockery. He exchanged a sly glance with Rivera, who chuckled softly, the sound cold and unsettling. Lauren hesitated, her arms trembling slightly as she held them out. She could feel the strain in her shoulders as she forced herself to comply. She knew that resistance, even the slightest show of defiance, could be dangerous. But compliance was equally terrifying. She was caught, trapped in their control, with no clear path to safety. Jackson stepped closer, his hands reaching toward her shoulders, resting there briefly before beginning his so-called inspection. His touch was deliberate, lingering just a moment too long as he moved his hand slowly down her arms. Every nerve in Lauren's body was screaming, but she forced herself to remain still, her breath shallow and uneven. "Relax, Mrs. Harris," Jackson sneered, his lips curling into a twisted smile. "Just making sure you're not hiding anything." She bit her tongue, refusing to let them see her fear. She knew that her silence was their victory, but any response might only provoke them further. Rivera watched with a detached amusement, his arms crossed as he observed the scene with a look of satisfaction. Jackson continued, his hands moving down her back, tracing a line along her spine. Each touch felt invasive, a violation thinly veiled as procedure. Lauren's muscles tensed, her body on edge as his hands moved lower. She felt humiliated, exposed, and every instinct screamed at her to run, but she knew she couldn't. Knew that even the smallest action would be met with consequences she couldn't predict. "Nothing here," Jackson murmured, though his tone suggested he was savoring every second. He stepped back, only to let Rivera take his place. The second officer moved in closer, his presence cold and calculated. He leaned in, his hands brushing against her waist, then sliding deliberately around her sides. "What's someone like you doing out here alone?" Rivera's voice was low, menacing, as though he was letting her know exactly how powerless she was. His fingers trailed down her arms again, his touch as chilling as his gaze. "Just heading home," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. She could barely recognize the sound of her own words, choked with tension and fear. Rivera smirked, his expression filled with contempt. "Home? I guess it must be nice. Bet you don't usually get your hands dirty, do you?" Jackson let out a low laugh, the sound filled with derision. "Yeah, probably used to having other people do the work for her." His words were coated with resentment, as though she represented everything he despised. The two officers shared a knowing look, their unspoken understanding palpable, as if they had rehearsed this dance of intimidation many times before. Lauren felt a surge of indignation beneath her fear. A spark of anger at the way they belittled her reduced her to an object of scorn. She wanted to shout, to remind them that she was a citizen, a person deserving of respect. But the words stayed lodged in her throat, stifled by the reality of her situation. Rivera's hand moved up to her shoulder, gripping it with a pressure that bordered on painful. "Look at you, Mrs. Harris," he said, his voice soft but dripping with malice. "Must be strange, huh? Out here all alone, no one to come save you." The words hit her like a punch, the implication clear. She was utterly vulnerable, isolated on this dark road, completely at their mercy. Her mind raced, her thoughts spiraling as she searched for any possible way out. any strategy that might shift the power dynamic even slightly in her favor. "Just doing our job, Mrs. Harris," Jackson murmured, stepping back as if to allow her a momentary reprieve. But the smirk on his face betrayed his true intentions. He wasn't done, and she knew it. The air around them felt thick, suffocating as the two men circled her, their movements slow and calculated. Lauren's every instinct urged her to escape, to put distance between herself and these men, but there was nowhere to go. She was trapped, surrounded by their smug expressions and silent threats. Jackson broke the silence, his tone laced with disdain. "People like you," he began, gesturing toward her with a dismissive wave of his hand, "think you're untouchable. Think you're above everyone else. But out here?" He looked around, his gaze sweeping the empty road. "Out here, your privileges mean nothing." Rivera leaned in closer, his face inches from hers. "We get to call the shots now, Mrs. Harris," he whispered, his voice barely more than a murmur, but filled with an unsettling intensity. His hand reached out, resting on her arm in a way that felt far too familiar. Lauren felt herself recoiling internally, a mix of fear and revulsion flooding her senses. She fought to maintain her composure, to keep her emotions in check. She couldn't show weakness, not now, not when they were waiting for any sign of it. "Guess tonight's lesson is learning how things work when you're not protected by those walls of yours," Jackson said, his voice dripping with condescension. Lauren clenched her fists, a small act of defiance that she hoped they wouldn't notice, but Jackson's eyes flickered down, catching the movement, and his smile widened, darkening with a twisted satisfaction. "Feisty, huh?" he sneered, stepping closer until he was towering over her. "You think you're better than us, don't you? Well, newsflash, Mrs. Harris. Out here, we hold the power." Rivera chuckled, the sound devoid of any humor. "Yeah, guess she's used to everyone doing what she says. Probably doesn't get told no too often." He tilted his head, his gaze mocking, as though she was nothing more than a source of amusement. Lauren forced herself to stay silent, though every fiber of her being screamed at her to fight back. She felt trapped in a nightmare, caught in the grip of these men who relished her discomfort, who seemed to take pleasure in making her feel small and insignificant. "Go on, say something," Jackson taunted, his voice a low challenge. "Or maybe you finally realize your place." Her silence felt like a betrayal, a submission to their twisted game, but she knew that speaking out would only fuel their cruelty. She could feel their satisfaction growing, the smugness radiating from them as they took in her compliance, her quiet surrender. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jackson stepped back, though the smirk remained etched on his face. He looked her up and down one last time, as if committing the image of her vulnerability to memory. "You're free to go, Mrs. Harris," he said, his voice mocking as he gestured toward her car. Lauren's legs felt shaky as she moved, each step feeling like an enormous effort. She climbed back into her car, her hands trembling as she gripped the steering wheel. She dared not look back, her only focus on getting away from these men, from the darkness of that lonely road, from the suffocating sense of helplessness that clung to her like a shadow. As she drove away, the laughter of Jackson and Rivera echoed faintly in her mind, a haunting reminder of the powerlessness she had felt in their presence. She knew, as the distance between them grew, that this was not over, that they would pay for what they had done, for the way they had stripped her of dignity and reduced her to an object of scorn. And as she drove into the night, the seeds of determination began to take root. She would find a way to expose them. She would ensure that they never held power over anyone again. Lauren Harris gripped the steering wheel tightly as she drove down the dark road, her mind a whirlwind of anger, fear, and humiliation. The hands of Officers Jackson and Rivera still lingered on her skin, phantom touches that made her feel tainted, stripped of her dignity. The darkness of the night seemed to echo the shadows in her mind, memories of their mocking laughter, their sneering comments, still fresh and sharp as knives. But before she could reach the safety of her home, she saw the flashing lights in her rearview mirror once again. Her heart dropped as she realized that the police car was following her. They weren't done. A cold wave of fear washed over her, mingling with the anger that simmered beneath the surface. Why were they stopping her again? What could they possibly want now? She pulled over reluctantly, her hands shaking as she turned off the ignition. She knew she had no choice but to comply, even though every instinct told her to flee. As Jackson and Rivera approached her car once more, she braced herself, praying silently for the strength to endure whatever they intended to do. Jackson rapped on her window, the sound sharp and grating in the silence of the night. She lowered the window slowly, her face a mask of forced calm. "Step out of the vehicle, Mrs. Harris," Jackson said, his tone even colder than before. His expression held a mix of disdain and twisted satisfaction, as if he were savoring every moment of her discomfort. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, but she obeyed, opening the door and stepping out onto the pavement. The two officers circled her like predators, their eyes gleaming with a dark, unspoken intent. She felt trapped, completely at their mercy, and the realization filled her with a sickening sense of dread. Jackson's gaze swept over her, his eyes lingering in a way that made her feel exposed and vulnerable. "Spread your arms again," he ordered, his voice laced with malice. She hesitated for a brief second, and that was enough to trigger his anger. He stepped closer, his face inches from hers, and hissed, "Didn't you hear me? Arms out. Now." Her body moved almost automatically, her arms stretching out at her sides. She tried to keep her mind blank, to block out the reality of what was happening, but the weight of their scrutiny made her skin crawl. Jackson began his so-called search once again, his hands moving slowly and deliberately, his touch invasive and humiliating. This time his hands lingered on her waist, his fingers pressing into her skin in a way that was anything but professional. Lauren felt her cheeks burn with shame, but she forced herself to remain still, to endure, because she knew that any resistance would only escalate the situation. "You know," Jackson drawled, his voice a mocking whisper, "people like you think you can buy your way out of anything. Think you're above the rest of us." His hands continued their slow, torturous movement, sliding down her sides and making her feel utterly powerless. Rivera, standing just behind her, let out a low laugh. "Guess she's learning her lesson tonight," he said, his tone thick with contempt. Lauren's chest tightened as she fought to hold back her emotions. The feeling of their hands on her, the weight of their taunting words, it all made her feel like she was shrinking, like every shred of dignity was being stripped away. She tried to focus on something, anything, that could help her endure, but the darkness, the silence, the empty road all conspired to reinforce her isolation. Jackson's hands moved slowly to her shoulders, his fingers pressing down with a possessive authority that sent a chill through her. He was making a point, taking his time, letting her know that he could do whatever he wanted, and she had no power to stop him. "Isn't this a nice change?" he murmured, his voice soft but laced with menace. "Bet you're not used to being on the receiving end, huh?" She said nothing, her silence a shield, though flimsy and fragile. She knew they wanted her to react, to see her break down, to feed off her vulnerability. But she would not give them that satisfaction. As if sensing her resolve, Jackson's grip tightened, his fingers digging into her arms with a force that bordered on painful. "You think you're better than us?" he sneered, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. "You think your little life of privilege makes you untouchable?" Rivera moved closer, his hand reaching out to grip her wrist, his touch rough and demeaning. He leaned in, his breath hot against her ear as he said, "Guess you're learning the hard way that out here, no one cares about who you are. You're just another spoiled brat who needs a reality check." The words stung, and Lauren felt a flicker of anger flare up inside her, a spark of defiance. But she forced herself to keep her expression neutral, to swallow down the bitterness and rage. She could not afford to let them see her react. Jackson's hands moved lower, resting on her hips in a way that made her stomach churn. His touch was slow, deliberate, each movement calculated to degrade and demean. She felt like an object, something to be used and discarded, and the realization filled her with a wave of nausea. Rivera watched with a twisted smile, his gaze lingering on her face, waiting for any sign of weakness. "Bet this is a night you won't forget," he said, his tone filled with dark amusement. Finally, Jackson released her, stepping back with a smirk that made her skin crawl. "You can go now, Mrs. Harris," he said, his voice mocking, as if he were granting her a favor. "We're done here." Lauren's legs felt weak as she turned to return to her car. She could feel their eyes on her, their satisfaction palpable as she climbed back into the driver's seat, her hands shaken as she gripped the wheel. She didn't dare look back, didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing her distress. As she drove away, her mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, humiliation, fear. She felt like she had been stripped of her dignity, reduced to nothing more than a target for their cruelty. The experience left her feeling hollow, a painful reminder of how powerless she had been in their presence. But beneath the shame and hurt, a spark of determination began to grow. She would not let them get away with this. She would find a way to make them pay, to expose them for the corrupt and cruel men they were. Back home, Lauren Harris felt the walls close in around her as the events of the night replayed in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling of violation, of being utterly powerless under the hands of those officers. Every touch, every mocking word lingered like a bruise, raw and aching. The once warm comfort of her home now felt like a prison, a stark contrast to the safety she'd always taken for granted. When her husband, the governor, finally noticed the hollow look in her eyes, he knew something was terribly wrong. Sitting across from her in their quiet living room, he reached for her hand, his face etched with worry. "Lauren, please, tell me what happened," he urged, his voice soft but insistent. There was a depth of concern in his gaze that broke through her initial hesitation. With a heavy sigh, Lauren recounted the events of the night in painstaking detail. She felt her voice tremble as she described the cruel hands, the mocking sneers, the sense of utter helplessness. Every word was laced with the humiliation and pain she had endured, and by the time she finished, her husband's face had hardened with barely restrained anger. His jaw tightened, his eyes dark with fury. "They did this to you?" His voice was low, simmering with a rage he barely contained. "Those men dared to lay a hand on you, my wife?" Lauren nodded, her own anger resurfacing as she met his gaze. She saw the determination in his eyes, the unspoken promise that he would make this right. For the first time since that terrible night, she felt a glimmer of hope. "I want to make sure they're held accountable," she whispered, her voice trembling with both fear and resolve. "I want them to pay for what they did." Her husband nodded, his face set with grim determination. "They will. I'll make sure of it." The following morning, he took immediate action. He called his team together, a group of trusted advisors who shared his sense of justice and his drive to eradicate corruption. He outlined the situation, giving them the details without sparing the horror of what his wife had endured. His advisors listened in silence, their expressions a mix of shock and outrage. "I don't care what it takes," he declared. "We are going to bring these men down. I want every stone overturned, every corner of their past investigated. I want to know everything they've done." With the full weight of his office behind him, he hired a private investigator to dig into Officers Jackson and Rivera's records. The investigator, a former detective known for his relentless pursuit of justice, took on the case with a fierce dedication. He combed through every piece of evidence, every complaint that had been filed against them. It wasn't long before the disturbing truth began to emerge. The investigator's report revealed a pattern of abuse and corruption that ran deep. Jackson and Rivera had a history of targeting vulnerable individuals, using their authority to intimidate and harass citizens who couldn't fight back. They preyed on those who were alone, who had no one to defend them, and used the power of their badges as a shield against accountability. Lauren's husband was appalled by the findings. He had known there were problems within the police force, but this level of cruelty and corruption was beyond anything he had anticipated. It was clear that Jackson and Rivera were part of a larger issue, a network of officers who believed they were above the law. He decided that this couldn't remain hidden. The public had a right to know the truth, and he was determined to bring the entire system of corruption to light. But he knew that going through official channels might not be enough. Too often, cases like this were swept under the rug, the victims silenced, the perpetrators protected. He needed a plan that would bypass the bureaucratic red tape and force the truth into the open. Lauren, still reeling from the trauma of that night, found herself drawn to the idea of taking the story public. She wanted to expose Jackson and Rivera for the predators they were, to strip away their power by shining a light on their actions. But she was also aware of the risks. Going public could bring retaliation, not just from Jackson and Rivera, but from others within the police force who might seek to protect their own. "Are you sure about this?" her husband asked, his tone both supportive and cautious. "Once we go public, there's no turning back. They'll try to discredit you, to paint you as the one in the wrong." Lauren met his gaze, her resolve firm. "I'm sure. I'm not going to let them silence me. Not now." With his support, Lauren began preparing her story. She knew that it couldn't be a simple recounting of events. She needed to show the public the full extent of the corruption, the abuse of power, and the suffering it had caused. She contacted a trusted journalist, someone with a reputation for fearlessness, and shared her story in detail. The journalist was horrified by what she heard. She promised to publish the story with integrity, to give Lauren's voice the platform it deserved. Over the following weeks, Lauren and her husband worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, connecting with other victims who had suffered at the hands of Jackson, Rivera, and others like them. When the article finally went live, it was explosive. The story spread rapidly, igniting a firestorm of outrage. The public was appalled, not only by the details of Lauren's ordeal, but by the systemic corruption that allowed men like Jackson and Rivera to operate with impunity. Social media erupted with calls for justice, for accountability, for change within the police force. As the backlash grew, Jackson and Rivera found themselves under intense scrutiny. They tried to deny the allegations, to paint Lauren as a privileged woman seeking attention, but the evidence was overwhelming. The investigators' report, combined with the testimonies of other victims, painted a damning picture that could not be ignored. The governor, Lauren's husband, held a press conference, standing firmly by her side. He addressed the public, his voice steady and resolute as he called for a complete overhaul of the police department's internal review processes. He promised a thorough investigation into all complaints of abuse and corruption, and he made it clear that no one would be exempt from accountability. "This isn't just about my wife," he said, his gaze unwavering as he looked into the cameras. "This is about every citizen who has been victimized by those who swore to protect them. It's about ensuring that no one else has to endure what she did." The impact of his words was immediate. The public rallied behind him, demanding justice for Lauren and for every other victim of police misconduct. Jackson and Rivera were suspended pending investigation, and it became clear that they would face severe consequences for their actions. Lauren felt a sense of vindication, a release of the anger and pain she had carried since that terrible night. But she also knew that this was only the beginning. There was still much work to be done, still countless victims who needed justice. Her experience had ignited a fire within her, a determination to fight for change, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been silenced by abuse of power. And as she stood beside her husband, watching the public's reaction unfold, she felt a sense of hope. The battle was far from over, but she was no longer alone. Together, they would push forward, demanding accountability and change until the entire system was cleansed of corruption. The conference room was filled with journalists, cameras flashing, and microphones held aloft as they waited for Lauren Harris to take her place at the podium. She felt the weight of their anticipation, the intense scrutiny that came with stepping into the public eye to share her story. But today, the fear and hesitation were gone, replaced by a steely determination. The days of staying silent, of letting others define her experience, were over. Her husband, the governor, stood beside her, his presence a steadying force. Together, they had prepared for this moment, knowing the risks but certain of their purpose. Lauren took a deep breath, gripping the edges of the podium as she scanned the room. Then, with a voice that was both clear and unwavering, she began. "Thank you all for being here today," she started, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "I am here not only as the wife of the governor, but as a citizen, as a woman, and as someone who believes that justice must apply to everyone regardless of status or position." The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Lauren could see the journalists leaning in, their faces a mixture of empathy and curiosity. She took another breath, letting the silence settle before she continued. "A few nights ago, I was stopped by 2 police officers," she said, her voice steady but tinged with the pain of the memory. What began as a routine stop quickly turned into an experience that no one should ever have to endure. I was humiliated, threatened, and treated as if I had no rights, no dignity. These men, entrusted with the power to protect, chose instead to abuse that power in the most degrading way possible. A ripple of shock moved through the room. Lauren saw expressions of disbelief, of anger, and it fueled her resolve. She knew that her story had already reached the public, but standing here, recounting the events in her own words, gave the ordeal a personal weight that no article could capture. "But this is not just my story," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "Since that night, I have learned that these officers, Jackson and Rivera, have a history of mistreatment, of targeting those who cannot defend themselves. I am not the first person they have treated this way, and if we do nothing, I won't be the last." The governor placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, and she felt his support bolstering her. She looked directly into the cameras, speaking now to the countless people watching from their homes. This cannot continue. No one should live in fear of those who are supposed to protect them. Today, I'm calling for a complete investigation into the actions of these officers, and beyond that, into the entire system that allowed this kind of behavior to flourish unchecked. I will not rest until every individual responsible for these abuses is held accountable. Her words hung in the air, powerful and unyielding. The room was still, the gravity of her message sinking into every person present. She glanced at her husband, who nodded, stepping forward to address the crowd. "We are committed to reform," he began, his tone as firm as hers. "This is about creating a safer, more accountable environment for every citizen. My wife's experience has shown us the dark side of a system that we thought we understood, but we cannot allow this darkness to remain hidden. I am issuing an order for a full internal investigation within the police department, and I will ensure that it is carried out with full transparency." The governor paused, his gaze moving across the crowd. "But we also need the support of the public. We need your voices, your stories. If you or someone you know has experienced mistreatment, please come forward. We are stronger together, and only by standing united can we root out the corruption that has festered for too long." As he finished, applause erupted, a show of support and solidarity that resonated through the room. Lauren felt a surge of hope. The fight was far from over, but this was the beginning of something powerful, a wave of change that could reshape their community. Over the next days and weeks, the impact of their words reverberated through the city and beyond. More and more victims came forward, sharing their own experiences of harassment and abuse at the hands of law enforcement. The stories painted a damning picture, revealing a culture of impunity that had long been hidden from view. Jackson and Rivera quickly found themselves at the center of a storm they couldn't control. Their attempts to deflect blame, to cast Lauren as a vindictive woman seeking revenge, fell flat in the face of overwhelming evidence. Public opinion turned decisively against them, and even within the police force, officers began distancing themselves from their actions. The investigation, led by a team of independent officials appointed by the governor, uncovered a network of corruption and abuse that extended beyond just Jackson and Rivera. It was a painful revelation for the community, a reminder that the problem was far more pervasive than anyone had realized. But it was also a moment of reckoning, a chance to address the systemic issues that had allowed such misconduct to persist. Lauren watched as the city came together, ordinary citizens demanding accountability and transparency from their leaders. The press coverage was relentless, and soon the story reached national headlines. People across the country were rallying behind her, their voices amplifying her call for justice. Meanwhile, Jackson and Rivera, once shielded by their badges, faced legal action for their crimes. As the evidence mounted, they were forced to confront the reality of their actions and the consequences that now loomed. For the first time, they were the ones without protection, without power. The system that they had exploited for so long was now holding them to account. On the day of the final court hearing, Lauren felt a profound sense of closure. She had taken the stand, recounting her experience in front of a judge and jury, her voice unwavering as she told the truth. And when the verdict was finally delivered, guilty on multiple counts, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Justice had been served, and the men who had once tried to strip her of her dignity were now facing the consequences of their actions. But even as the trial concluded, Lauren knew that her work was not finished. The journey to reform the system was only beginning, and there were still countless people who needed protection, who needed a voice. She and her husband continued to advocate for change, working with community leaders and activists to ensure that this moment would lead to lasting improvements. In the end, Lauren's ordeal became a catalyst for a movement that went far beyond her personal story. It was a call for justice, a demand for accountability, and a reminder that no one, regardless of status, position, or power, was above the law. As she stood before the crowd once more, this time not as a victim, but as a leader, she felt a sense of pride and purpose. The path forward would not be easy, but she was ready to face it, knowing that she had the strength to turn her pain into change and her story into a legacy of justice. Thank you for watching this video to the end. Subscribe to the channel to stay up to date with new stories, each one revealing unique experiences and exciting twists and turns. Stay tuned for the next video and our other stories, as there are more intriguing events and deep themes to come. Join our community. We look forward to seeing you again.